I think we're going to move on. I just want to introduce a few of the students that work in the lab at ASU and just highlight some of the great work that they're doing. So the picture here shows an Arizona wilderness area, it's Sycamore Canyon. We have a project that's funded by the U.S. Forest Service, and Maggie Huck, is working on deploying acoustic loggers in these headwater streams, and she's interested in tying neurons to stream flow in these areas. And then Brett Montgomery is working on a project that's funded by the Heritage Grant through Arizona Game and Fish Department. He's focused on looking at the occupancy of Arizona toad across its range from the Verde River watershed over to the White Mountains. And this project has certainly put us in some of the most spectacular backcountry areas of Arizona. And the other part of our lab, we do a fair amount of urban work as well. And so Annika Inlow is a master's student in the lab and looking at social and ecological patterns for snake removals in the Phoenix area. So I'll be talking about mostly urban focus today. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this work. Jeff Brown was a former postdoc with us and is now a faculty at LaSalle University. My colleague, that's a spatial ecologist, Fabio Albuquerque, and Paige Warren is an urban ecologist. In the fall semester, I was just on sabbatical leave and was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and we were thinking about some urban ecology projects. And so I think I'll start there. In terms of my background, I've certainly done the bulk of my research in riparian areas in stream systems throughout the desert Southwest, asking a lot of applied questions, removal of salt cedar and how that affects habitat structure and what that means for species like lizards and amphibians. When I got to ASU in 2008, I was introduced to a group of urban ecologists through the CAP LTER. Sorry for the acronym, it's a big one. It stands for Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project. And this is an effort that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and we're in about our 25th year of data collection. I wasn't there since the beginning, but we can all build on this long-term data set. And so my talk tonight is going to focus in two parts. The first part, like we say in CAP, we talk about the ecology in cities. And so I'll focus on the long-term data that we have along the urban Salt River, looking at lizard communities and tying that to environmental factors. And then I'll talk about the ecology of cities. And that is in terms of thinking about how human decisions can influence the outcome for biota. And in this case, we'll talk about people making decisions about how they manage their yard and how they handle snakes that might come into their spaces. And in terms of urban ecology, to set the stage for this, a lot of cities are in areas that overlap with high biodiversity. People as a whole, we now live in cities more than not. And this happened about a decade or so ago. So more people live in cities than any place else. And cities historically have been built along, say, waterways. That was important for commerce, transportation, movement, trade. And these areas are rich in diversity. And this is Phoenix, and we often colloquially will say Phoenix is called the Valley, right? And what valley are we talking about? This is the Salt River Valley. And not many people say it, but I think Phoenix is a river city. We have three rivers that come into Phoenix. We have the Verde River, and that confluences with the Salt, and the Salt River then confluences with the Gila. So we have lower elevation in this area, historically agriculture. And a lot of urban ecology in terms of thinking of plants and animals. There's been a fair amount of contribution on thinking about how birds use this area. Some of the patterns we see there is that generalist species tend to do well in highly modified areas. But in our desert cities, we still have Sonoran desert species that are tied to places that do have more xeriscaping and in close proximity to open spaces. Now, our urban area, situated in the desert Southwest, is also influenced by long-term drought conditions. And this graph, you can download this for your own area through the US Drought Monitor. You enter your location and your time frame. And this is for Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is. And 75% of the time period since 2000 is in drought. And the drought severity index here, the various colors of red and orange indicate drought. D4 is the most severe drought classification, and those most extreme years are certainly in recent time. And this can have implications for all kinds of biota. And in terms of reptiles, we know a lot of our squamates that are in the Southwest. A lot of these species are at their margin of thermal limits. And so if they are dealing with drought conditions and high temperatures, they're having to do things like reduce their activity. I reference here the urban heat island, and this is something we definitely see in the city of Phoenix, and I'm sure here in Tucson as well. And so the city, the built environment, concrete, et cetera, is absorbing heat, solar radiation all day, and then radiates it back to the night sky in the evening. And so the nighttime temperatures in cities are hotter than the surrounding desert. And so we'll have some, we'll talk about temperature a little bit. So first part of the talk here, ecology in the city. So I'm gonna tell you about our long-term data set that we have. And we've been doing visual encounter surveys for herpetofauna along the Salt River. And really, I could just say lizards. The bulk of that data set is lizards because we do these surveys during the day. And our study reaches, we have 7 study reaches along the Salt River. And 5 of those are perennial streams. We'll call those wet reaches. And 2 are intermittent, so they're dry, but they also will carry water during rain events and during other urban inputs through drains, et cetera. And so I'll give you a little tour of some of those sites. But here we're looking at what are the predictors of some of the abundance of lizards in this area. All of these sites, 1 through 7, have ownership that has not changed in a very long time. They're mostly municipals and agencies. And so in terms of, is urbanization changing around these sites? Not really. But what can be changing is things like how vegetation is managed. And so we've looked at some of those, and that's through spatial data sets, so satellite images, looking at the land surface area. And the reflectance of green can be summarized in a vegetation index. And so that's what NDVI is referring to, how much green biomass is on the ground. And we can also look at NASA DayMet weather data. And so we can average daily data on temperature, precipitation, humidity, and summarize those at the same time scale that we're collecting data. So our sites do differ in the surrounding area a little bit. That's this graphic on the bottom of the slide. So the brown area would be bare soil or shrub. Anything red is going to refer to impervious surface and development. So you see a lot of red in some of those sites. In other sites, not so much. And so here's a little bit of a tour just to reference a few of these sites. So sites or reaches, sorry, I'm using those interchangeably. So on Tonto National Forest, this is sort of a peri-urban site. It is on the National Forest, but this abuts Mesa. And so it's just like 5 miles from city limits, really. And this is a perennial reach. And so it does support cottonwood trees. And the top 3 that I have here, I'm sure we could test everybody on their 4-letter lizard codes, right? And so I'm using some 4-letter codes as shorthand there. So the most common species would be, what would be the common name, folks in the audience? Yep, common side blotch lizard is our most common species. Second most common, tiger whiptail, and then ornate tree lizard. Yep, exactly. So those are the 3 most common species found here. And then I'll just show you a couple more sites. So getting into the heart of the city, those are Papago Buttes in the background. So this is pretty close to Sky Harbor. And it's a perennial site. So the top 3, again, that side blotch lizard, tiger whiptail, and we'll also pick up a few bullfrogs in this. And that's the, as we get closer to the water's edge. So here's one of those intermittent or dry reaches. And it's interesting, common side blotch lizard, still the most common in this area, number 1. Number 2 is Callosaurus, so that's a zebra tail lizard. And then number 3, that's Larry's lizard back there, that's the desert iguana, right? And I used to joke with students and technicians when we were setting this up, you know, in this riverbed, as it were, I'm like, boy, if we ever start seeing desert iguana, we are no longer in riparian. And well, there is a site where we get desert iguana. So a lot of lack of vegetation in this site, right? So some of the questions then we were interested in, just abundance, long-term trends, what does the last 10 years look like for lizard abundance? And then look at 2 species that are the most common. So the side blotch lizard represents about 39% of the data set, so it is fairly common. The second most common is the tiger whiptail, and so we could do some species habitat relations with those 2 animals. And then we want to relate abundance to some of those bioclimatic variables that I mentioned. And so we'll just look at some of those trends. So unfortunately, a lot of downward trends. And so the graph that you see here is abundance of herpetofauna. And I will say we do see 19 species in the urban salt river, 4 species of anurans, 4 species of snakes, and 10 species of lizards. But by far and away, you know, these are daytime surveys. It is more biased towards lizard fauna. The decreases that we're seeing, the dotted lines, each line represents one of those steady reaches, and the dotted lines are the dry reaches, just to sort of point out where they are. So they're certainly not the most abundant, but they're also not the lowest. Different players, right? So there's a different species composition in those dry reaches. But what we do see is this decreasing trend. And if we compare the early years to most recent years, the wet reaches, yes, they're declining 40%, maybe not as great as the dry reaches, but still things are in decline. Now looking at individual species, looking at the side blotch lizard is the dark symbols on the top, that's their abundance over the period of study. And then the gray symbols are the tiger whiptail abundance over the period of study. Now those horizontal lines that you see, the black line is the 10-year average for side blotch lizard. And so it's just a way to illustrate how side blotch lizards can be a little bit of boom and bust, right? So these are a short-lived species. They live about 14 months, which is pretty rare for a vertebrate to have that short of a lifespan. And they're a sit and wait foragers, so they hold territories, they do push-ups or head bops, which is very different than sort of the tiger whiptail life history. So tiger whiptails certainly are longer life species. They don't hold territories and kind of reduce their activity later in the season as adults to kind of have all their resources met, and they don't need to deal with holding territory, so they just kind of reduce activity later in the season. But they're not quite as boom and bust. Those averages are a little bit closer to that 10-year line. Tiger whiptail abundance is lowest in the most recent years, but side blotch is kind of all over. Looking at what the vegetation is doing along these reaches, so the green symbols represent the vegetation cover in those wet reaches, and then the brown symbols are the dry reaches. lot of variance with those wet reaches. It's somewhat of a factor of sample size, right? There's more reaches that are perennial versus the dry. But we don't see any change over time. We don't see a time effect here. So we do see some fluctuations, but the wet sites certainly have perennial reaches, definitely are supporting more vegetation than those intermittent sites, those dry reaches. So looking at some of the models here, looking at total abundance, we just put it all in the hopper. What we see is that the best predictor of total abundance is daily maximum temperature. And so when daily maximum temperatures go up, abundance goes down. And that was our strongest model that predicted overall abundance. Now, looking at those two species that are fairly common, the tiger whiptail and the side blotch lizard, the tiger whiptail abundance was associated with vegetation cover. So during periods and in reaches where vegetation cover was high, tiger whiptails also had high abundance. Inconclusive model for side blotch. So whatever we measured was not a good predictor of their abundance. So I will move on from that and try to make sure we have time for questions on that. But I think some of the implications of this work is, these species are affected by urbanization and drought, and it looks like that the perennial reaches are supporting a fair amount of habitat. And I think it's important to keep tree cover. It's good for wildlife, and it's also good for people. It also can help buffer some temperatures there. Okay, so transitioning now into some of the social ecological patterns along that same vein. And I sort of alluded that we think of this as more of ecology of cities. So this is thinking about human perceptions and decisions and how that might influence the outcome of reptiles. And in this case, we're talking about snakes. And so for this work, we've partnered with Brian Hughes of Rattlesnake Solutions. And Rattlesnake Solutions LLC operates in the Phoenix area. And it also, I believe they also operate in Tucson. And this is a paid service. So the clients of Rattlesnake Solutions call up the company and say, hey, I've got a snake. I'd like you to come remove it. And so Brian's team will come out and remove snakes. And they're not a kill operation. Snakes aren't harmed. They're moved to suitable habitat in a close area. And it was really great to be able to partner with Brian on this effort, because the amount of snakes in Phoenix being removed from yards, quite frankly, is staggering. And so it's a huge resource just to ask questions about snakes in the city. And then we could also ask some questions about people using this service. And so I want to highlight my collaborators here. So Kelly Larson is a social scientist. So when we're deploying a survey, we're using social science techniques in terms of how we're structuring our questions. There's a lot of thought that go into that. We might ask a similar question several different ways and make a composite index to see if the answers are consistent over those questions. So anyways, really enjoy our collaborations with the social science team. And Jeff Brown is very much social scientist, wildlife biologist. And I'll mention some of the work that Annika is doing for her master's. So in terms of, human-wildlife interactions happen where there's habitat supporting nature, wildlife, and also a high density of people, right? And so part of that interaction is going to be dictated by what's important to the species we're studying and also people. People's view of wildlife can vary by socioeconomic factors like income and age. And we know that cities are built inequitably. They're built inequitably for people and for nature. And so biodiversity is not equally distributed across urban areas. And we've seen some particular patterns. And some of this work started by studying nature in Phoenix. And so the luxury effect that I allude to up here, that paper by Hope, they were looking at tree cover in Phoenix, and they found that there's more tree cover and tree diversity in high income areas. So that's the luxury effect. We see examples of this with trees, birds, and lizards in Phoenix. That's Jeff Ackley's work. But we don't see this pattern everywhere across all cities for all species. So I'll just, there's caveats here. So Seth Magel, Chris Schell, and many other authors recently published a paper across over 20 cities in the US looking at coyote distribution. And sometimes the luxury effect is seen like Phoenix or whatever, but it's not everywhere. So just want to put that out there. And in terms of our methods, we use Brian's data. I'll just keep going. So let's look at some of the data. So the first column you see is we have 2 years of snake removals. Basically, over 1,000 snakes a year are moved from Phoenix yards. And to me, that number was just mind-blowing. That's a lot of animals, and that's a lot of information. And so the species of snakes are listed in order of most abundant to least based on that rattlesnake solution data set. What you see in parentheses, that's the percentage. And so, for example, 68% of all removals were Western diamondback rattlesnake. The second is Sonoran gopher snake, 16%, etc. That next column, iNaturalist, so this is a community science platform. People can take pictures of insects and plants and post it, and the community identifies it. So looking at 10 years of iNaturalist snake data out of Maricopa County, and there's like 1,500 records. So the data set, the wealth of information is pretty good. And then, certainly some other publications there by Tom Jones and colleagues and Brian Sullivan. And these are studies focused on finding and looking at snakes, right? So it's just a pretty important data set. And so we can look at where snakes are removed. We can ask questions about where they are in space and time. And so the bar graph that you see, you can think of that as activity. So when do snake removals happen? They happen in the spring and they happen during monsoon season. And I bet that's pretty darn close to the activity of Western diamondback rattlesnakes, right? So I think the removals certainly reflect the people are interacting with the most common species when those species are active. Looking at the map, this is Maricopa County. Phoenix is situated in Maricopa County. And we looked at the socioeconomic data from census blocks. So you can think of these as neighborhood level scales. And so each of those lines is demarking a neighborhood. And then the color would say how many removals come out of those neighborhoods. And there's certainly hot spots, right? So for the rattlesnake removals, certainly some hot spots up there in Cave Creek area, and the McDowells and sort of North Phoenix Mountains. Looking at non-venomous snake removals, there's also some hot spots, and they're a little bit different. I'll toggle back and forth and kind of see, they're not always in the same place. And some of those non-venomous removals are even further down into the city. And we can also look at their activity for that. Now, looking at the census data, this is looking at what are some of those socioeconomic factors that might be related to those snake removals. And so a couple of important points. First, this is a paid service, right? So there's already going to be a bar at who is able to access this, this service. And we also know, and we expect that because of that human-wildlife interaction, that removals are going to happen in places where there's a lot of people and that are near habitat. And so at the bottom, population density and distance to desert parks, we controlled for those factors. Now, when the bars swing out to the right, that means they're positively related. So we see, I'll just say it in plain language. So more snakes are being removed from areas that have high income and have high education. fewer snakes are being removed from neighborhoods that have both high income and high education. Now, some of those other factors, the lines are really small, and so those aren't as important to the interpretation. So we do see a luxury effect when it comes to that service of removing snakes. So I mentioned a social survey. We've been working with Rattlesnake Solutions to deploy a survey to the clients that are using the service. And in that, we were asking them several different questions about how they feel about snakes. And we also wanted to ask, where was the snake when you first found it? So where are people observing snakes in their space? And how do they feel about snakes? So what are their attitudes? And do they have any experience with snakes? And maybe that influences their motivation for wanting the snake removed. And so those were some of the questions. And I'm just going to go through some of these slides. Basically, when people said that when they first saw the snake, over half of all snakes, where would you guess? Where would you guess they saw the snakes? Mostly. Yeah, in the shade, but in the backyard, right? Where there's vegetation, exactly. So half of all people that took the survey said, yep, I saw it in the backyard, it was on my back patio. About a quarter, and anytime I have sort of in italics here, those are direct quotes from the social survey. So someone is actually commenting, yep, bushes in the backyards where I water. About a quarter of the respondents said it was in the front yard, it was right on the doorstep, it was on the front patio. 8%, now this is pretty rare, snakes moving into people's inside, right? So in the garage, about 8% are in the garage, some people up against, some type of material in the garage. And then this is where I ask you, can you find the snake in the garage, right? And it's in the cup holder in the camp chair. That's a Western Diamondback rattlesnake in there. Yeah, I don't even know how they saw it. And then, okay, even more rare, the snake makes its way inside of people's homes. And not making any of these, none of these are posed. These are technicians taking the picture where they saw the Sonoran gopher snake in somebody's shower. Only 2%, this is very rare. And then this is pretty shocking too, Western Diamondback in somebody's bedroom. And the resident here said they had left the slider open and, the snake probably came in right from there, right? Okay, now looking at the motivations, why did you decide to use the service? And we gave them a whole variety, and then we also let people fill in answers. So what was the reason? And then we wanted them to rank it. Like the snake was a threat. This was a major reason or not a reason at all, right? And so we're looking at that. So what were the motivations? By and far, it was like, the snake is dangerous. I have small children and I have pets, right? So don't really like the snake. Big scary snake, bro. But other people very much were happy to have a snake, like see the snake. I love snakes. I would never kill one. I just don't want it in my garage, right? And so we had kind of, very different motivations, if you will. And so what we were interested in is, could we separate people into groups that have different motivations and then ask about their attitudes about snakes, okay? And so here, this was parsing the data. So of all the respondents, let's just look at folks that said, I want the snake moved to desert habitat. That was a major reason, but they did not say that they were scared of snakes. They said that wasn't a reason. So there was about 122 that fall into that category. The fear category, much fewer. But still, we could parse out and say, okay, now there's some that say fear is the number one reason why they were motivated to use this service, and they didn't feel strongly about needing to move the snake to habitat. So just taking those two groups and looking at their attitudes, okay? So I call it the habitat motivation and the fear motivation, right? And so this is looking at whether or not they feel positively or negatively towards snakes. And this is probably just as you would expect. the respondents that were fearful of snakes had more negative views, and they also were more okay with lethal measures, taking lethal measures to handle snakes. So this is a bit of a composite. We ask people a variety of questions like, when is it okay to kill a snake? And generally, just to say that another way, people motivated by having a snake removed because they wanted it moved to desert habitat were saying, no, it's not okay to kill a snake. So probably not unexpected. Now, experience, what would you guess? Which group would have maybe had more experiences with snakes? The habitat motivated folks or the fear motivated folks? Yeah, right. So people that had hardly any experience with snakes, were in that more fear motivated category. And again, we asked them a whole variety of questions. Have you ever seen a snake in the wild? Have you touched a snake? If you have, how many times, right? So people with these ecological motivations, there's some experience there. And so just want to, have a nod to the herpetology class. And it's just really great taking students in the field. And if there's anything, it's getting snakes in the hand and just sparking that interest. And students really do appreciate that. I would say most students that are taking herpetology have not held a snake. Some of them have not held a frog. And so those experiences are pretty important, I think, for that. Okay, just the last couple of slides here. And I wanted to highlight some of the work that Annika Inlow is doing for her master's degree. And so taking the location data of where snakes have been removed, she quantified habitat in the front yards. She didn't trespass anywhere. She just walked transects on the sidewalk in front of people's houses. And she visited over 200 neighborhoods. And so we have a subset of places where snakes have been removed versus what's available to them in the urban space. And what she found is that compared to these random yards or what's available, removals where snakes are being removed, they're coming from places that have more low cover. And so there's a western diamondback under the lantana in that photo. So that's what we mean by cover for snakes. And also the yards tend to be more cluttered. So this tidiness to cluttered scale, this is a parameter that we see in urban ecology in terms of trying to quantify people's spaces. So here's an example just taken from Google Earth. That's a fairly tidy yard. Yards that are more natural, or maybe they're not natural, but they just have stuff in the yard, right? And there might be a curled up hose and a pile of toys and whatever, right? And so we tend to see snakes associated with those types of yards. Now she looked at some spatial variables, and this is looking at 2,000 points across the Phoenix area. And in this, she's looking at that, how much urbanization is surrounding those removals. And snake removal yards are coming from highly urban areas. And again, this is somewhat of that, you got to have people in the equation for that human-wildlife interaction. We do see a difference between the rattlesnakes and things like gopher snakes. So gopher snakes are associated with more of that urbanization than, say, rattlesnakes. And this probably isn't surprising either. Like gopher snakes, they just kind of get into everything, right? And they're good at climbing. They're good climbers. They can get over block walls. Rattlesnakes, maybe they don't really care about climbing that much compared to a gopher snake. Okay. So I will wrap up and certainly want to give a little bit of time for questions if we have that. But what can we learn from studying people interacting with snakes? It's just understanding the places that we live and how can we live well in our places. So people are definitely interacting with common species, and how they manage their yard might provide habitat or not. And maybe this is important for helping people understand how they might want to manage their yard to not be something that a snake might want to visit. And it's also important to think about, these removals are coming from areas where people have the capacity to engage with that service. But even within the clients, we did not see things related to income, ethnicity, and education when we got to just the clients. And perceptions might be important to think about when we're thinking about things like conservation of species like snakes. And for some future, we would like to look at the outcomes of snakes once they get removed. So we've chatted with Brian, have some ideas about how we can do that. Someone give us transmitters, please. We keep writing grants, but it would be great to do a study to look at the outcomes for snakes. And we're continuing the work on the social science data set. We're pairing the client data set with a more general data set, so general public, as opposed to people using the snake removal service. What are the attitudes of Phoenix residents towards snakes? So thank you so much for inviting me to come talk with you all. And I'm happy to answer questions if we have that time.
So my question is, I know that in certain parts of Phoenix, there's flood irrigation. Do you have any information about how that affects urban lizards, like cooling and well, any effect that flooding landscapes has on herps?
Right. So I'll rephrase the question slightly to make sure I understand. So yes, Phoenix has flood irrigation in some of the older parts, certainly around Tempe, there's flood irrigation. The main pattern, I think, the difference between those flood irrigated yards and like some of the new build is we would call those mesic or wet yards. So there's big trees, there's lots of lawn, and then more xeriscaped. So I'm not sure about lizards. I would guess there's a lot more Mediterranean house geckos and things like that, and maybe less of our Sonoran Desert folks in that. With birds, I can say the species composition is entirely different. Yeah, the mesic yards are supporting things like grackles and a lot of birds that are associated with some of that water. But the xeriscaped yards, that's where you get your cactus wrens and your curve-billed thrashers. And yeah, so we have seen that. So I imagine, yes, there's a difference. So can I unmute Brian? I can't read the whole comment, Brian. Brian Sullivan.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So my question was about your Salt River surveys. And I wonder, with the temperature shift, explaining the reduction in numbers, could you parse out that it was unrelated to rainfall differences? And I'll just fill in by saying, out at Cave Buttes, we notice a huge difference in rainfall impacts in short time spans, not only for when you detect them within a year, but then subsequent years, especially with Uta, Aspidiskellus, and the Callosaurus and Scalopera. So I'm just wondering, are you certain it's the temperature and not the correlated shift in rainfall, since we've had drier years of recent?
I don't know, is a biologist sure of anything?
Yeah.
So, the way that we summarize the data, it is daily data. So we have daily temperature, daily precipitation. And I'm trying to think how we could summarize that a little better. And you have to make sure also in your models, because they're on different scales, that they're all relative to each other. But I hear what you're saying. So you'll have these small episodes of moisture, but the lizards and snakes are responding to that as opposed to temperature. I have to give that more thought. I mean, yes, yeah, that's a good point to think about that.
And if I can, I also meant long term, meaning the reproduction in all of these lizards that are relatively short lived is such that within a year you see a population response. of a good wet summer versus a couple of dry, bad summers, if that makes sense.
Right. So I was thinking of the model with the side blotch lizard because, right, it's inconclusive right now. And because it's that boom and bust type species, what we did look at, so we did parse out the temperature and precipitation data to even look at like, how hot is it in the hottest quarter? Or how wet is it in the driest quarter? So we kind of looked at all of those elements, but what we didn't look at is a lag effect or a lag year, right? So does it matter if you had a wet summer 2 years ago? And that might matter for, I don't know, maybe reproduction.
Thanks. Great.
Thanks, Brian.
Heather, this is Walker speaking from Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Oh, hello.
Do you have any evidence that there are resident populations of reptiles in the Phoenix area? Like, for example, in this city, we have no program, but I live on a lot with a thriving population of Storia decayii or decayi, depending on your preference. The decay snake. It's a tiny little thing, but it's very abundant on the lot. We see many a year.
Yeah, no, I mean, lizards, yes, are definitely living in the city. And I think, I don't have data to back this up, but I'd like to do this project. I think lizards, and Jim, I may be straying from even answering your question, but I think some species that are more associated with climbing, so like that gopher snake pattern that we see. So in the middle of the city, we'll have on cinder block walls in the backyard, ornate tree lizards do better than, say, big chunky Scloperus magister. So I think there's something to like how they interact with the habitat that maybe allows them to do okay in cities. But yeah, lizards definitely live their whole lives in city, and snakes too. Like when I talk to Brian and his team, they'll catch snakes and they kind of look beat up, and you know, they're like, I think this snake has lived its entire life in this city. I don't know, Jim, did I stray too far in your answer there?
No. One other thing, how widespread are urban herpetology emphases?
Well, I think it should be more.
Well, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be more, but I said, how widespread is it now?
You know, there's literature that comes out of sort of these squamate hotspots. So Australia, there's a fair amount of research. If we're talking about snake removals, there's even a fair amount of literature in like India and in places that are living with venomous snakes, but not near as much as, say, literature on mammals, literature on birds. That's sort of the bulk of urban wildlife. Definitely birds and mammals, way more than reptiles and amphibians. Question in the room.
Yeah, okay, so with a lot of the species you listed in your presentation, I know that urban and suburban Maricopa County is just a small part of their distribution range, but do you think urbanization and increase in drought trends can cause a lot of them to be uplisted by the IUCN? And also, if I could add to that, like a higher need for Brian Hughes services, could that also contribute to like the necessity for uplisting for some of these species?
So in terms of being in an urban area would cause them to
have
down?
population declines and whatnot that affect the species overall?
Well, I mean, the pattern that we see with a variety of organisms is in urban spaces is there's winners and losers. And some species do okay and are commensurate with humans, and others we've already lost. So frankly, you didn't see any horned lizards on our list, right? And Brian Sullivan could probably attest to this. They do not do well in urban areas. And so I think the species, the subset of species that we see right now, there's already been a filter. And some have not passed through it. Some have not done okay with urbanization. And so in that case, if they continue to lose habitat, then that could be a bad thing. But if we, it depends how cities get built too.
And if I could ask one question to piggyback on that, have you ever advocated for captive breeding programs for some of these species you've worked with or studied, like in response to the effects of urbanization and whatnot?
I haven't, but tell me a little bit of what you mean by, how do you see a role there?
Well, I guess I generally see zoos and aquariums as stationary arcs, and I'm of the belief that every wild animal and plant species, subspecies, and distinct population segment, when and where possible, needs a captive or ex situ assurance population as a way to kind of help boost their numbers and whatnot, and kind of serve as a reserve.
Sure, no, I think that facilities and certainly zoos and conservation biologists that work there have played a big role in Arizona T&E species.
Right. Hey, thank you. Appreciate it. Anyone else?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw the name flash by from Brian Sullivan of Sonora semiannulata, and I think that's a species that would be very interesting to look at it in greater detail.
Yeah, really low numbers from our data. I see a message in the chat.
Brian, I think you have data to show it's quite abundant in some areas of Phoenix, at least.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Bob. I just heard your question as I came back from grabbing a drink of water. You're going to have to rephrase again.
Yeah, I don't really have a question. I guess I'm just beating a drum that Sonora semiannulata might follow completely different patterns than any of the other species that are showing up in the list here.
I think you're right. They are an urban exploiter. I think they're doing quite well in many urban areas.
And I think surveying for them, they're not the kind of snake people are going to pick up the phone and get a removal service. So I think, but certainly looking under things in quite central Phoenix, they seem to persist, and be very interesting to know more about say irrigated versus non-irrigated areas, things like that.
Yeah, I think so. Larry, did you want to ask your?
Sure. Great talk, Heather, by the way. I have about 1,000 questions, but I think I'll limit it to one or two. So as Brian Sullivan pointed out, hi, Brian, desert iguanas are my current favorite lizard, although maybe long-nosed leopard lizards are getting there. But so you didn't talk much about them. I'm just kind of curious about, are they a species that is maybe filtered out by urbanization? And in the areas where they do persist, are they maybe handling the climate change a little better than some other species since they have such high heat tolerances and other factors?
Great question. I have no idea. So out of our 7 reaches, they're at one site.
Oh.
And on 35th Avenue. What? And it's not even on the margin of the city. So I think they're hanging out in the corridor, river, that dry riverbed. And as long as they have creosote flowers to eat, maybe they're okay. But we haven't seen any predatory lizards. So definitely no long-nosed leopard lizards.
Okay, then I'll throw in my second question. I remember, and I don't know the details of this, but I read a paper several years ago about somebody doing a study of scorpion stings from Arizona bark scorpions, especially in the, I don't know if it's Maricopa County or just Phoenix area. And I think they kind of did what you're showing up there with snake removals in the areas. And so certain areas are getting hit a lot harder with stings. and some other areas. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that and if it aligns with rattlesnakes.
Right. So yeah, everybody has a scorpion story, certainly in Phoenix, probably Tucson too, right? And they're like in one patch and they're not in the other. And is it from land use and blah? In our program, Jesse Lewis has mentored a student that was looking at calls to poison control about scorpions. I think that's where they got their data. So it's like a public database, right? And looking at that across an urbanization gradient. And, oh wait, was it that? They also did nighttime surveys. So they went out with a black light next to their camera traps. So they were studying mammals, but while they were out there at night, they could also, do some scorpion data. And so they looked at 3 species of scorpions and looked at how they related to like urbanization, just as one gradient. And the bark scorpion did pretty well with urbanization, but other species like the striped tail or whatever, and giant hairy, their highest numbers were in more periphery, lower urbanization. So that is one effort that I know that tried to quantify scorpions in Phoenix, but.
Okay, thanks.
Question about fear of snakes and education programs and social education programs. I agree. CAP LTR works with some schoolyard programs where the students are designing different projects and they have access to maybe camera data and different data in their schoolyards. And so there's an education component within our LTER group. That would be good to add some lizard or snake data. We have done some lizard stuff with schoolyards, but yeah, I think snakes would be
Heather,
good
I have
too.
a couple questions or thoughts on this, if you don't mind. They're going to veer off just a bit. First of all, my question, what's the charge for coming and having a animal removed from your yard? Or is this a social service?
Yeah, no, it's a paid service. Rattlesnake Solutions does.
And wouldn't that kind of make a difference where it was skewed up to the higher socioeconomic?
Yep.
So
And
I wondered
sorry
if-
if I didn't make that point clear enough.
Well-
Yeah, there is a bar of who can participate in the service.
It was obvious. I mean, I think we all got that.
Okay.
If we don't have enough money to do certain things, we aren't going to call the snake removal. I would wondered if you'd consider a program similar to what you did, not with the snake removal, but the counts and what happens to these snakes in the lower socioeconomic level. I know you said that they're more prevalent, but are they more prevalent because people call? Are you aware of that they're more prevalent because people are calling for the snake removal, or just that they're seeing them? Has there been a survey of them in the yard and nobody calls?
Haven't surveyed yards for snakes at all.
Or-
So it's only the removal data set.
Ah.
And there we see a pattern with high income.
Sure.
More snakes get removed from there.
And what about, is there a possibility of ever doing some kind of similar survey in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods?
Sure, I think that
If you
would
had the
be
money.
definitely interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I
and
think
that's
that would
why
be
we want
very-
some transmitters.
I think that'd be
fun.
educational. Being a former teacher, I would love to see that as an educational tool for for those areas, and also just to see what they say.
Sure, and so we do have a social data set that is much more representative of Phoenix than the rattlesnake removal clients. So Kelly Larson and Jeff Brown do what's called the Phoenix Area Social Survey, and they have 12 neighborhoods that are stratified across urbanization, socioeconomic status, and it's a booklet, it's a questionnaire, and in that questionnaire were several snake-related questions. And so that's some of our next steps, is looking at things like attitudes and experience with snakes from the non-snake clients, if you will. So we
Gotcha.
could get views from the general population of Phoenix. Yeah.
And just in case you aren't aware, Dennis Caldwell's has designed a beautiful coloring book about herps in urban areas and interactions with people. If you, there's a bunch back on the table.
Okay.
So take them home with you.
Oh.
That'd be great. I had another question, but I forgot. Maybe somebody else has one here that's interesting.
So, thanks everybody for zooming in.
Thank you, Heather. Let's give her another round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everybody on Zoom. Let me turn this off.